At 11:40 p.m. Washington time, President Donald Trump ordered U.S. Central Command to stand down from a large strike package already locked for execution against Iran. Bombers were fueled, naval assets were in position, target folders were loaded. The order came less than 24 hours before impact. This was not a minor change, it was the cancellation of a full-spectrum attack that would have reshaped the Gulf theater by sunrise on May 19, 2026. And it happened after a wave of urgent calls from Riyadh, Doha, and Abu Dhabi. The strike was ready. The forces were spun up. So why was it stopped at the last minute? And what does that decision reveal about who actually holds leverage in this conflict? Welcome, and thank you for being here watching Frontline with John. This channel exists for viewers who want real context, not just headlines. And your continued trust means everything. If this is your first time here, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you never miss a story that actually matters. Before we begin, drop a comment and let us know where in the world you are watching from today. This is May 19th's aborted engagement. This is the moment the Middle Eastern theater shifted from the brink of catastrophic kinetic escalation to a hyper-fragile diplomatic window that could collapse at any hour. This is not a theoretical future war. This is a live operational pause inside an active conflict cycle that has been building since late February. According to reporting from Axios and the Washington Post, President Trump engaged in urgent consultations with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, Emir Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani of Qatar, and President Mohammed bin Zayed of the United Arab Emirates within the final 24-hour window before execution. The Gulf leaders delivered a unified message: do not pull the trigger, not because Iran had backed down, not because a diplomatic breakthrough had occurred, but because the Arab Gulf states assessed that their critical infrastructure would become immediate targets the moment US bombs started falling on Iranian soil. The context was a May 17th drone strike that clipped the perimeter of the UAE's Barakah nuclear power plant. Emirati officials have not publicly attributed the attack, but Gulf intelligence assessments, as cited by Western outlets, point toward likely Iranian-backed actors. That claim has not been independently verified by neutral third parties. What is verified is this: regional infrastructure is exposed. Oil terminals, desalination plants, power grids, LNG export facilities, and above all, the Strait of Hormuz. The planned US strike package, according to defense tracking indicators and flight pattern analysis, likely included long-range bombers supported by multiple aerial refueling tankers, carrier-based strike aircraft in the Gulf, and cruise missile platforms positioned in the Arabian Sea. 5 tanker aircraft were reportedly airborne simultaneously during preparatory windows earlier this week. That pattern suggests extended flight operations requiring multiple refueling cycles. Only specific aircraft types operating from specific bases would require this tanker support configuration for missions against deep Iranian target sets. This indicates strike packages targeting inland facilities, nuclear sites, IRGC command nodes, air defense batteries, not coastal targets, deep penetration. Iran expected limited symbolic retaliation, a calibrated exchange, a proportional response consistent with previous US doctrine under constrained political circumstances. Instead, it was facing the prospect of a large-scale air campaign designed to degrade strategic capabilities across multiple target categories. Then it stopped. The strike never launched. The missiles stayed in their tubes. The bombers held on the tarmac. For 24 hours, Gulf capitals conducted what can only be described as a regional pressure campaign against the White House. Their core dilemma was economic survival. Gulf intelligence reportedly assessed that if the US resumed large-scale bombings, Iran would unleash asymmetric retaliation across oil facilities, LNG terminals, desalination infrastructure, and maritime traffic. Not symbolic strikes, systematic targeting. Over 20% of the world's oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz, roughly a third of global seaborne crude. The strait is narrow, 21 miles at its tightest point, with shipping lanes just 2 miles wide in each direction. It is a choke point by design and by geography. Saudi Arabia exports approximately 6.2 million barrels per day through Hormuz. The UAE exports another 2.2 million. Qatar exports nearly all of its liquefied natural gas through the same waterway. Kuwait, Iraq, and Bahrain are similarly dependent. A closure, even temporary, would spike oil prices beyond $150 per barrel within 48 hours. Insurance rates for Gulf shipping have already increased 40% since early May. Lloyd's of London has quietly advised several major tanker operators to consider alternative routing if available. There is no alternative routing, not at scale. For decades, Iran's deterrence doctrine has relied on one central assumption: if cornered conventionally, close the strait, weaponize geography, disrupt energy markets, raise global costs to intolerable levels, force negotiations. This week, Tehran institutionalized that leverage in a way it never has before. The Persian Gulf Strait Authority, or PGSA, was formally stood up as a bureaucratic body claiming sovereign management authority over transit through the Strait of Hormuz. Iranian state media boasts that more than 1,500 merchant vessels are currently idling, awaiting permission to pass. That figure has not been independently verified, but commercial shipping trackers, including marine traffic and automatic identification system data, do show increased loitering patterns near the approaches to the strait, particularly around the Musandam Peninsula and Keshem Island. Iran is not just signaling with missiles, it is signaling with paperwork, bureaucratizing coercion. It is also signaling in the digital domain in a way that has received almost no mainstream coverage. The IRGC has begun threatening permit regimes and transit tolls for subsea fiber optic cables running along the seabed of the Strait of Hormuz. These cables carry significant portions of global internet traffic between Europe, Asia, and the Gulf states. The idea is elegantly simple. If energy markets are vulnerable, so is data infrastructure. Energy and bandwidth. Two levers, one choke point. Technically, enforcing such a regime would require persistent maritime domain awareness, patrol craft capable of marking cable routes, and undersea monitoring capabilities. Iran has invested heavily in fast attack craft, naval mines, shore-based anti-ship missiles like the Noor and Qada systems, and unmanned surface vessels operating in swarm configurations. Individually, these systems are limited in lethality and survivability. Collectively, they complicate engagement geometry inside a narrow waterway where superior U.S. naval platforms have restricted maneuverability. A single naval mine costs thousands of dollars. Clearing operations cost millions and require weeks. A single anti-ship cruise missile costs perhaps several $100,000. Each interceptor missile fired to defeat it costs several times that. This is cost imposition strategy at scale. Iran spent years building this layered denial capability. It does not need sea control. It does not need to win naval engagements. It only needs disruption, temporary closure, economic shock. Meanwhile, the diplomatic track is brittle. Fragile does not begin to describe it. President Trump stated publicly on Truth Social and to the New York Post that serious negotiations are now taking place and that a deal is close. However, open source analysis of the texts reportedly exchanged through Pakistani back channels indicates a fundamental deadlock on every core issue. Washington's position: Iran must immediately surrender its entire highly enriched uranium stockpile to U.S. custody and accept a 20 to 25-year total ban on all enrichment activities. Sanctions relief would be partial, temporary, and conditional on verifiable cessation of proxy funding. No war reparations, no ironclad non-aggression guarantee against future U.S. or Israeli strikes. Tehran's position: no surrender of stockpiles under any circumstances. No sweeping nuclear concessions tied to ceasefire frameworks. Full and permanent lifting of all economic sanctions as a prerequisite to further discussion. Total release of frozen assets held in South Korea, Japan, and European banks. formal guarantees against future strikes embedded in enforceable international agreements, reparations for damage inflicted since late February. These positions are not adjacent. They are structurally incompatible. There is no middle ground currently visible in the diplomatic text. Iranian state media frames the pause as evidence of U.S. strategic hesitation and declining willingness to absorb costs. That claim aligns with domestic messaging needs inside Iran, but not necessarily with observable force posture. CENTCOM, according to official statements released by Pentagon spokespersons, has been explicitly ordered to maintain full readiness for a full, large-scale assault on a moment's notice if the Pakistani back channel fails. The bombers remain spun up, the carriers remain on station, the blockade units remain deployed across choke points. This is not de-escalation. It is a tactical breath before potential catastrophic escalation. For years, U.S. strategy in the Middle East has relied on the assumption that overwhelming air power can coerce state compliance without triggering uncontrollable regional escalation. Precision strikes, limited duration, dominance in the electromagnetic and kinetic spectrum, minimal ground presence. May 19th's aborted strike tests that assumption in a way no previous engagement has. Because the Gulf allies just signaled clearly that the secondary effects, oil shocks, infrastructure attacks, energy price spikes, domestic unrest, may be strategically intolerable even if the U.S. wins tactically in the air. This reveals a constraint on U.S. freedom of action that Tehran has now observed and will exploit. Oil markets reacted immediately. Brent crude prices ticked upward on news of the near strike, climbing from $89 per barrel to $96 within hours, and remained volatile after the cancellation was reported. Shipping insurance rates for Gulf transit have risen 40% since early May. Defense stocks climbed on expectations of sustained readiness posture and potential procurement acceleration. Diplomatically, Pakistan has emerged as an unlikely but logical mediator, hosting back-channel talks in Islamabad. That creates a narrow window, reportedly 2 to 3 days, according to Gulf diplomatic sources, for a bridging framework to extend the April ceasefire without resolving underlying disputes. Iran's army spokesman Mohammad Akraminia issued a public warning via the Iranian Students' News Agency that if the U.S. mistakes the pause for weakness and resumes offensive operations, Iran will immediately open new fronts against the U.S. with new equipment and new methods. That is almost certainly a reference to proxy networks embedded across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and potentially maritime cells positioned in the Red Sea and Bab el-Mandeb choke point. This suggests a multi-theater response option, not symmetrical, asymmetric. Not force on force, network disruption. The new equipment phrasing likely references upgraded drone systems, potentially including longer-range one-way attack UAVs and loitering munitions with enhanced guidance packages. The new methods phrasing suggests operational patterns not yet observed, potentially coordinated swarm attacks, cyber-physical combined operations, or targeting of logistics nodes supporting U.S. presence. The decision point now sits with 2 leadership circles operating under enormous internal and external pressure. In Washington, President Trump must choose between accepting a narrow, face-saving interim framework that leaves Iran's enrichment capacity largely intact and risks domestic political backlash from hardliners, or resuming the strike plan and risking region-wide retaliation that could destabilize energy markets, strain alliances, and potentially draw the U.S. into prolonged multi-front engagements. His political calculus is complicated by upcoming electoral cycles, donor pressure from both interventionist and isolationist camps, and real-time criticism from both sides of the aisle. In Tehran, supreme leader-aligned hardliners within the IRGC and Guardian Council must decide whether limited concessions, temporary enrichment pauses, partial sanctions relief, token gestures on proxy activity, are preferable to absorbing a potentially unprecedented U.S. air campaign targeting nuclear facilities air defenses, IRGC command nodes, and critical infrastructure. Their calculus is shaped by regime survival imperatives: domestic unrest simmering since 2022, economic collapse under sustained sanctions, and the existential threat posed by losing enrichment capability entirely. Deterrence reading versus escalation reading. If Tehran believes the pause signals genuine U.S. reluctance driven by Gulf pressure and electoral concerns, it may harden its negotiating stance, calculating that Washington will ultimately accept a weaker deal to avoid regional chaos. If it interprets the pause as a final warning shot, a last chance to compromise before devastation, it may seek a temporary framework to preserve core capabilities while buying time to rebuild and reposition. The evidence points to internal tension on both sides. Public rhetoric remains maximalist. Operational posture remains aggressive. Diplomatic text remains stalled on fundamentals. Iranian media continues broadcasting victory narratives. U.S. officials continue emphasizing military readiness. Neither side has signaled willingness to abandon core demands. As of this hour, observable force posture tells the real story. U.S. naval assets are positioned across the Gulf of Oman, the Arabian Sea, and within striking distance of the Strait of Hormuz. At least one carrier strike group remains on station. Submarine activity, though classified, almost certainly includes Ohio-class guided missile submarines capable of launching Tomahawk cruise missiles from submerged positions. Strategic bombers, likely B-52s and potentially B-2 stealth bombers, are on alert status at forward operating locations. Tanker aircraft remain within rapid launch cycles, capable of supporting deep strike missions within hours of tasking. Iranian coastal missile batteries remain deployed along the northern edge of the strait, particularly around Keshem Island, Bandar Abbas, and Jask. Fast attack craft patrol in dispersed formations to complicate targeting. Mobile air defense systems, including Russian-supplied S-300 batteries and domestically produced Bavar 373 systems, remain active and repositioning periodically to avoid strike mapping. Merchant vessels loiter at the approaches, creating congestion that complicates military maneuver and raises the risk of miscalculation or accidental engagement. The strait is open, ships are moving, but it is tense. Every transit is calculated, every patrol is watched. Pakistan's mediation effort hinges on convincing both sides to accept a phased framework: temporary enrichment freeze in exchange for partial sanctions relief, extended ceasefire with monitoring provisions, and agreement to resume comprehensive talks within 90 days. That framework does not resolve the nuclear issue. It does not address proxy networks. It does not lift all sanctions. It does not provide ironclad guarantees, but it creates space, time, a chance to step back from immediate kinetic exchange. Whether either side will accept such a framework remains uncertain. Iran has historically resisted freezes that leave sanctions in place, viewing them as traps that erode capability without delivering relief. The U.S. has historically resisted partial deals that leave enrichment infrastructure intact, viewing them as pathways to eventual breakout. The clock is running. Pakistani diplomats are shuttling between Islamabad and Gulf capitals. Text is being revised, red lines are being tested. The next 48 hours will determine whether this pause becomes a bridge to a fragile temporary ceasefire extension or simply a final breath before the largest U.S. air campaign in the region since Operation Iraqi Freedom. The forces are in position. The target lists are loaded. The choke point is primed. The diplomatic window is open, but it is closing. One path extends the ceasefire by days or weeks, freezing core disputes but avoiding immediate escalation. It kicks the existential questions down the road. It preserves capability on both sides. It leaves the conflict unresolved but contained. The other path restarts the strike clock. Bombers launch, missiles fly. Iran retaliates across the Gulf. Oil spikes, markets panic. Allies are forced to choose sides. Proxies activate. The region ignites, and once that path begins, it is very difficult to walk back. The decision now sits with negotiators in Islamabad, with advisors in the Oval Office, with commanders in Tampa and Bushehr, and ultimately with the presidents and supreme leaders behind them. President Trump has demonstrated willingness to strike and willingness to pause. That creates uncertainty. Uncertainty can deter, but it can also embolden. Iran has demonstrated willingness to absorb strikes and willingness to retaliate asymmetrically. That creates risk. Risk can paralyze, but it can also provoke. The strait remains the hinge point, the waterway through which 1/5 of global oil flows. The choke point that can be closed with mines, missiles, and bureaucracy. Iran does not need to win. It only needs to disrupt.